I will give the floor to ADEMI, sorry, the program coordinator, the Roma Inclusion Secretariat Foundation. The working area of ADEM covers the communication between the European Union and the Decade of Roma Inclusion, with a special emphasis to the inclusion to the enlargement countries. And I would like to ask you this following question. What resources is the Decade of Roma Inclusion providing compared to the European Union framework, and which resources directly are connected with the ones of the European Commission?
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Dolores. Dear representatives of the Croatian government, representatives of other governments, civil society and international organizations, participants on the 23rd ISC meeting. I would like first to apologize on behalf of our director, Mr. Rob Kushen, who regrets that he could not make it to this meeting, and I was asked to forward his greetings and sincere wishes for a fruitful meeting. I would first welcome everybody to this event on behalf of the Decade Secretariat, the office that keeps track of the Decade of Roma Inclusion development, acts as a repository, and it's the silent motivator of the crescendos, I will call them, in the Roma inclusion in the 12 countries in Europe. I'm happy today to share the panel with two persons who are very knowledgeable on Roma policy developments in Europe, two good friends of mine. This is the first event under the Croatian Decade presidency. But as you can notice, it's 23rd in a row, so 23 ISC meetings are behind us. The first meeting was held in 2003, and it was symbolically named Roma in an Expanding Europe. It was initiated, as was mentioned in the opening panel, also by Mr. George Soros from the Open Society Foundations and Mr. Wolferson from the World Bank, and supported by the European Commission. At that meeting, the idea of establishing the Decade of Roma Inclusion and the Roma Education Fund was tabled and supported by the European Commission, that time by Ms. Anna Diamantopoulou, the Commissioner responsible for Employment and Social Affairs. So this was happening in 2003, exactly 8 years before the Commission launched the communication for EU framework for national Roma integration strategies up to 2020. The meeting led to this International Steering Committee meetings, one of the strongest and most successful resources that the Decade brought to the European scene. Why I call it strongest and important? So as you can notice, it brings national, international and civil society key players together to discuss, to analyze and prepare activities and also experiences, and evaluate the progress twice a year under the lead of the presidencies. In this opportunity, I would like to congratulate also the Croatian government for taking over the presidency, and I wish a successful year of presidency on behalf of the Decade Secretariat. I'm happy to see that the European Commission successfully initiated the EU framework for national Roma integration strategies, reflecting on the Decade's defined priorities of employment, healthcare, housing and education. Already was mentioned the same 4 priority areas, and by coincidence, Mrs. Dolores is the national contact point for the EU framework for national Roma integration strategies, but same time the national coordinator of the Decade of Roma Inclusion. So many of the things are built upon. What can the Decade offer to enrich the EU framework process? So what can this platform bring us in reality? First, the Decade has provided excellent expert approach to all the 4 areas and the cross-cutting issues also on gender, poverty and discrimination. As you know, each presidency organizes thematic workshops on a given topic, with inviting governments, inviting experts and civil society. The past Decade workshops have been provided ample evidence of good practice in Roma inclusion, and the Secretariat is in the process of collecting now a systematic database and analysis of good practices for dissemination to Decade member states, EU member states and the public. So we are continuing in that way, in a bit more systematic way, and actually focusing and accenting on the transferability on the good practices that we will analyze from one country. We hope soon to come out with results on that. Second, The decade provides a platform for engagement of civil society and governments together. Up to this point, the EU framework process has been largely a process of governments. We encourage the Commission to create similar opportunities for civil society engagement as well. If the Commission does not find this to be practical, the decade will continue to do so. One of the important functions of the civil society in the decade process was the critique to the work of the governments in fulfilling their pledge under their national action plans. This feedback was provided in the decade meetings, as you remember, and also 2005-2010, the very well-known Decade Watch reports that somehow was served as an impetus for governments to do more. The Decade Secretariat is now facilitating a civil society monitoring of the EU framework process by providing a template for civil society to use in the production of shadow reports in selected Decade member states, including those who are presently in the EU, also and those ones who aspire to join. The shadow reports will make use of data gathered by the Fundamental Rights Agency and others, helping to ensure robust implementation of the national Roma integration strategies. This is something that we recently started, and we truly believe that will provide civil society perspective on the implementation of the national Roma integration strategies and will act as a watchdog of the implementation. Finally, the decade provides a forum of EU member states and non-EU member states to share experiences on Roma inclusion. While the framework is open to enlargement countries, to date only EU member states have submitted strategies to the Commission. None of the enlargement countries did so. The decade is prepared to provide assistance to non-EU member states in revising their strategies and national action plans and to meet the EU framework criteria, as it was requested in the communication from 5th of April 2011. Moreover, the decade will continue to invite EU and non-EU member states to participate in practical workshops on topics of direct relevance to the EU framework process. By continuing to expand its geographical reach, the decade will provide a useful supplement to the EU framework effort. We are grateful today to have the presence of the government representative of Turkey and Moldova with us, and we hope that they will continue to play an active role in the decade with stronger commitments in the upcoming future. It will be not wrong if we say that the decade of Roma inclusion set up the cornerstones for wider European policies, set up the basis with all its advantages and disadvantages, and with resources that the European Commission is and should continue to build upon in a joint cooperation with the decade. This cooperation should be developed to a synergy format. I mentioned the word synergy here. I mentioned it in Brussels at the beginning of the Macedonian presidency, exactly because of the terminology as it is by dictionary. To reach a result that the two initiatives cannot reach separately. To come to synergy to reach the greater result. This would be my closure note here, and I will be happy to respond to any further questions.